Over the course of the coming few years, as the supply chains break down and people watch their savings eroded into worthlessness, as the media spoon feeds us more cover stories and politicians begin floating the notion of food rationing, GMOs, digital IDs, and eventually carbon-based social credit systems, a sizable segment of the population are going to find themselves confronted with the question, who is Klaus Schwab? On the face of it, this seems a pretty easy one to answer. Front and centre of Schwab's most substantial of resumes is his role as founder and chairman of the World Economic Forum, an international non-governmental and lobbying organisation which engages the foremost political, business, cultural and other leaders of society to shape global, regional and industry agendas. As such, Klaus has his hand in a variety of progressive causes: climate change, economic inequity, and sustainability just some of his key areas of concern. So too is he an author, economist and business guru, a philanthropist, policy advisor, and vocal proponent of a kindlier capitalism. Not to mention, as a growing number of MSM fluff pieces invariably do, Schwab's newfound status as the cheerfully bemused subject of numerous right-wing conspiracy theories. It is my intention, throughout the course of this series, to piece together a rather less sterilised image of the man, to go beyond his ghost-written books and carefully constructed press releases in hope of glancing the real motivations behind the Fourth Industrial Revolution. To do this directly is nigh on impossible. So thoroughly has the WEF purged the mainstream internet of details detrimental to their ambitions that much of Schwab's life has been airbrushed into non-existence, fragments of his character and thus evidence of his worldview, instead unearthed by profiling those known to have influenced him. This will include ideological allies and business mentors, college educators and even spiritual leaders. But whatever early impression any of these individuals may have left on Schwab, it is those bonded by blood with whom he bears the most striking resemblance. To my parents Eugen Wilhelm Schwab and Erika Epprecht, who taught me firsthand the value of education, collaboration, and the stakeholder principle. The passage above is taken from the dedication of Klaus Schwab's recently published Stakeholder Capitalism, a book which, in essence, constitutes his manifesto for the planet's post-COVID economy. This is the sole mention Schwab is recorded as making of his parents, or at least the sole mention which survives in the public domain, and yet even this brief glimpse into his inner world is only partially true. Looking back at the time and place of Klaus's birth, Germany, March 30th, 1938, it is tempting to attribute the departure of his biological mother to the political circumstances of the time. Certainly, Emma Gisela Tequila Schwab was just one of the many Jews to have fled to America during Germany's pre-war years, and while some reports enthusiastically adopt this line of argument, others cite her characteristic independence, as well as the dissolution of her previous marriage, to suggest a far more mundane family breakup. Either way, Emma's abandonment left a mother-shaped hole in infant Klaus's life, a hole which was to be filled by Erika Epprecht, a woman far more in keeping with the Nazi ideal, and by extension, the career prospects of his father Eugen. Eugen Wilhelm Schwab was born in Switzerland just before the turn of the century. However, when he was just 1 year old, his own father, Gottfried, took his wife and young child back to his native Germany, so as that he might ply his trade as machine engineer. This was to prove something of the family business. On the advice of his father, advice that he too would pass down to his sons, Eugen Schwab entered the same field of study, eventually taking up employment at a factory in Ravensburg, a town to the south of Germany, just miles from the borders of both Liechtenstein and Switzerland. Escher Weiss, themselves a Swiss company, first began business in the weaving trade, although it was whenever they branched out into the areas of industrial turbines and hydroelectrical power that they were to ultimately establish their reputation. This reputation grew considerably with the outbreak of war in 1939. Under the management of Eugen Schwab, and with the benefits of being headquartered in an officially neutral nation, Escher Weiss enjoyed the enormous profits which came with assisting the Nazi war effort, supplying the Wehrmacht with everything from flamethrowers to parts for fighter jets. In a less immediate sense, the company was also integral to Hitler's quest to build an atomic bomb, manufacturing as it did elements necessary to production. And yet, despite Escher Weiss's evident importance, despite even its status as a National Socialist model company, Ravensburg was left entirely untouched by Allied bombing campaigns. The reasons for this are still much debated. While the official story insists that the town was designated off-limits due to nearby humanitarian operations, it is generally accepted that its safety was ensured due to a secret agreement struck between the Nazis, Allied forces, and unnamed individuals within the Swiss business community. This, needless to say, is a fascinating chapter of Schwabian history, one with profound implications. And so if you're interested in delving further, please consider the podcast by AIM Truthbits linked in the description. The hosts expertly dissecting Switzerland's history as a nerve centre for globalist scheming. Of course, how his father's job impacted a young Klaus is all a matter for conjecture. It would seem that Eugene's guidance, if only in regard to career development, was either accepted or enforced within the Schwab household, both Klaus and his younger brother Jules Reiner going on to train as machine engineers. In the case of the better-known sibling, this was only the beginning of the academic credentials. Schwab's plethora of university degrees, bankrolled by Escher Weiss's head office in Zurich. Here arises another interesting footnote. You see, it was around a time when a teenage Klaus was perusing college application forms that Schwab the Elder was busily establishing Ravensburg's Chamber of Commerce. This he was doing, at least in part, at the behest of the British Pilgrim Society, a network of Anglo-American governing and banking elites who, in collaboration with elements inside both MI6 and the CIA, were using Ravensburg as a transit hub for stolen Nazi gold. This episode represents yet another intersection between Schwab's lineage and the seldom spoken of chapters in European history. And while Big Tech has predictably memory hold most of the details, you can still do a little more digging into the characters involved via the links below. Regardless of where the funds for Klaus's schooling came from, or even why Escher Weiss chose to provide them, it seems reasonable to conclude that, upon his graduation, it was Eugen who helped show his son the ropes. Klaus's first role in Escher Weiss was as assistant to the chairman. In this position, he was charged with overseeing the company's merger with Sulzer, another large Swiss engineering firm to have made out lavishly from the war. This achieved, he then set about enhancing their shared technological capabilities, while then forging closer ties with Braun Boveri, yet another Nazi-affiliated operation. Schwab almost single-handedly transformed Escher Weiss, now functioning under the name Sulzer AG, into a bona fide engineering juggernaut. Klaus's arrival also coincided with a fundamental change to the company's business philosophy. Long considered pioneers in the field of nuclear technology, the earlier iterations of Sulzer AG had limited their contribution to manufacturing parts for power stations. Yet scarcely had Schwab the Younger stepped into the fold, then emphasis switched to a rather more sinister commodity: nuclear weapons. Once more, the careers of Klaus and his father can be heard to echo. While it is unlikely that any group will ever surpass the Nazis' reputation as history's archetypal boogeymen, within more recent decades, few have endured more wholesale condemnation than apartheid-era South Africa. Without wading into specifics of that troubled nation, it is clear that what Schwab exhibited in helping arm the pariah regime was the same moral malleability his father had in equipping the Nazi war effort, behaviour that would rather undermine Klaus's current progressive persona. But Schwab's ancestry gets darker still. Back when Eugen was manager at the Escher Weiss factory, he had at his disposal the collective manpower of thousands of forced labourers. These were comprised of the demographics you might expect: Jews, gypsies and homosexuals, as well as hundreds of French and Russian soldiers. Ravensburg at the time accommodating so many prisoners of war that the Nazis were driven to construct the Zeilerstrasse 16, one of their largest forced labour camps. These were far from the only atrocities being played out in the background of Schwab's was formative years. When the law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases was signed into law in Germany, Ravensburg quickly established itself as an epicenter for the practice. individuals with varying degrees of physical and intellectual impairments transported to the local hospital in order to undergo mandatory sterilisation. We will likely never know what a younger Schwab thought of such barbarism. Neither can we tell with any certainty how often any of these topics were discussed around the dinner table. We cannot tell if Klaus ever objected to his father's business connections or use of slave labour, any more than we can appreciate the contradictions which must have churned inside an adolescent Schwab, all along knowing the truth of his Jewish heritage while outwardly conforming to the Aryan ideal. Perhaps, and this is arguably more troubling still, none of it fazed him. Today, Klaus no doubt cuts an unflappable figure, a man whose every inch is designed to convey an image of reason-guided competence and natural, benevolent authority. It is just such qualities, after all, which a desperate and ill-informed citizenry might wish to see in an individual, offering to absolve them of their woes. And yet, if only that citizenry would take the time to dust the buzzwords away from Schwab's worldview, then they would see the same neurosis and obsessions which have always propelled the aspiring tyrant. Transhumanism in particular strikes such a chord. The listener likely has no need for me to point out the parallels between the experiments of Joseph Mengele and Schwab's fascination with brain implants in the metaverse, the genetically designed babies and minds uploaded to the cloud. I'm sure you too have been similarly chilled by the rhetoric of Yuval Noah Harari, Klaus's chief advisor. It might even be said that the deranged fantasies of these men far exceed those of earlier despots, technological advances having allowed them to apply their system of control not just to government, the economy and our societies, but right down to the chromosomal level. These ideas, taken in conjunction with an very depopulation agenda, are nothing if not nakedly Hitlerian. Schwab's vision of Humanity 2.0, that microchipped, algorithmically regulated fusion of man and machine, merely a modern rebranding of the master race. But no matter how much Klaus's genocidal convictions were informed by his upbringing, what makes the man behind the Great Reset so truly dangerous is his willingness to cash in on human suffering. In the 50 years since launching the European Management Symposium, as the WEF was originally known, the forum's founder has quietly manoeuvred his wealth of business interests in order to do just that, emulating in the process an example that was so explicitly set by Eugen. But Klaus's opportunism is greater still. Unlike his father, Schwab intends to be both the beneficiary as well as the architect of mankind's misery. The graduates of his Young Global Leaders program, all eager to enforce his diktats. Yes, we might call him a monster. Yes, it would be easy to make comparisons with the century's most notorious butchers. In time, it is quite possible that Schwab's infamy will surpass even theirs. But for now, all this ostensibly unremarkable technocrat is doing, and again placing himself at the forefront of unfolding tyranny, is following the footsteps of Schwab family tradition.